So, you found me again. And this time you brought that thing into my house. Technically you brought this and I just transported it here. And you liked what I brought you last time. Yes, that's true, but that is an AtGames system. From AtGames. You know, AtGames, the company that makes these cheap, crappy systems with the poor emulation and the bad controls. But this one is different. It's the 2018 model. It's been improved. I don't care what model it is. I don't want it in my house. But you're the one who brought it in here. I know. I'm not touching that. Then you leave me no choice. Then you leave me no choice. Haha! I know. There's probably a few questions going through your head right now, such as, Patton, why are you doing this? Are you sick? Is everything okay? No, really. Is everything okay? And yes, everything is fine, don't worry, I know what I'm doing. We're gonna take a look at the AtGames Sega Genesis Flashback. The reason I'm doing this is because I've had multiple people come to me and say that this system isn't actually that bad. And you know me, I like to give these things a fair shot. I gave the PlayStation Classic a fair shot, and we all know everything that was going on with that system. But that was a first-party system, and this is AtGames. The same AtGames who gave review copies of their products to different reviewers on YouTube with arcade ports, but then released the actual systems with Nintendo games. Shady practices like that AtGames. But even with all that, I still had people asking me to take a look at the system and insisting this is worth your time and money. First, let's talk about AtGames itself and the history of these flashback systems. AtGames has been making these systems for a very long time. I know in excess of 10 years. I don't remember if they started out with the Genesis Flashback or the Atari Flashback, but I know they were both in stores at the same time. First one I ever saw was a long time ago in a Bed Bath & Beyond. I think it was the Atari Flashback. And I bought it and returned it the next day. And the Genesis flashbacks weren't any better. There were complaints about the controls, the emulation. It was extremely poor emulation. The games sounded horrible. They looked like this, not like a Genesis at all. Yes, I have one of these. So what makes this one different? Why would you waste your time on a console that has had nothing but negative press and reviews in the past? First, we're going to take a look at what's inside the box. Alright, so before we get into what's in the box of the 2018 Sega Genesis Flashback, we need to look at the box itself. There's probably not been a more important box of any of these systems than this one, because that is how you're going to tell if you have the correct model. First thing you want to look at is the very top. You will have the AtGames logo as well as the logo for the AtGames Flashback Zone. Some other models will only have the AtGames logo right in the middle. That's the incorrect one. On the front of the box you'll have these 5 icons in the bottom left corner instead of the 4. You have the wireless controller icon, HDMI, save and resume games, rewind games, and the cartridge slot. But the biggest tell that you have the correct one is if you look at the Genesis itself. You'll see on the 2018 version that this has a volume button. You can look at the controllers as well. If only one controller has the rewind menu and start button, you have the correct version. Also, if you look in the corner of the system, you'll see the AtGames logo is down here and not in the middle. And again, on the bottom, you have the picture of the Sega Genesis, again with both controllers. look out for that volume button. Alright, let's open this up. Alright, so we're greeted with a couple pieces of paper here. This first one is instructions on how to pair the controllers to the console. And rather than an instruction manual, it seems they have included an instructional poster with various FAQs, different button assignments, and explanations on how to do different things with the system. We have a 5-volt micro USB AC adapter. Under the Genesis Flashback, we have an HDMI cable. The system comes with 2 wireless controllers. Each controller has the A, B, and C buttons, as well as the X, Y, Z buttons. On the top of each controller is a on and off switch, a blue LED light that indicates when the controller is turned on, the D-pad over on the other side, and for the Player 1 controller you have rewind, menu, and start buttons. The Player 2 controller only has the start button. Besides the lack of buttons on the second controller, you can tell which one this is by the indication on the top left. On the back of each controller is a battery cover for 2 AAA batteries. Then we have the system itself. You have this LED which turns red when there is power to the system. In the bottom right corner is the AtGames logo. You have your on and off switch, as well as a menu button. This volume rocker doesn't actually move, it is only cosmetic. On the rear of the console you have your micro USB power input and HDMI output. Now for the most interesting part of the system itself, on the front you have 2 controller ports for original Sega Genesis controllers. But not only that, the system accepts original Genesis games with a cartridge slot. If you still have your original Genesis games and controllers, you can use those on the Sega Genesis Flashback. And then on the right side of the system you have an SD card slot. We're going to go into that in more detail later. Now I have to admit, this isn't the first Flashback system that's come into my possession. I received this one as a gift many years ago. Not sure what year this one came out, but I just wanted to do a brief comparison between the old version and the newest version. You can see that this old version looks nothing like a Sega Genesis, and unless the name wasn't here on the top, you probably wouldn't recognize it. You have the on and off switch, the menu button. The old version has a DC input for power, and component audio visual out. No HDMI. The old system did come with 2 wireless controllers as well, but they were infrared, meaning to play this you actually had to point the controller at the system for it to get any signal. But on the top you could select which controller could be player 1 or player 2. Another complaint people had about the old system was to change the batteries, you actually had to unscrew the battery cover. Like I said, the new controllers are 2.4 GHz wireless, and you can pop off the cover easily. However, the old system did allow you to use the old controllers and had a cartridge slot for games. So that's everything that comes in a box for the AtGames 2018 Sega Genesis Flashback. So you can see AtGames made a lot of changes to the physical system. They made it look more like the original Genesis. They improved the controllers, they improved how you insert the batteries to the controllers. And if you still have your old Genesis games and controllers, you can use those as well. So why did AtGames make such a drastic change to their system? And honestly, I think it has a lot to do with the Sega Genesis Mini. When Sega made the announcement originally, they said AtGames would be running the development of the system. And as we all know, the fans went into an uproar about it, and they said this was terrible, and right out the door the Genesis Mini sounded like it was going to be a failure. Until Sega smartened up and said, never mind, we're not going to work with AtGames, which is probably one of the best decisions I've ever seen a game company make for their product. So I think that opened up AtGames' eyes in a sense, and they thought one of 2 things. They were either upset that Sega decided to not let them work on their system, and they were trying to prove a point saying, hey look, we can make a good system too. Or they were like, you know what, maybe everybody's right. Maybe we do need to try harder and make a good system. And that's what we have. The problem is that there wasn't any advertising for this system. Sega made a different system that looked almost exactly like this back in 2017. They were already starting to make some changes, but the only change they made for the 2017 model was that it could be output to HD, and the physical design of the system looked more like a Sega Genesis. But come the holiday season of 2018, they released this version. And this thing is hard to find. I couldn't find it in any store. I had to get this online. Luckily, I found one on Target, and the description of the item said it's not sold in stores. I could only get it online. Like I mentioned in the unboxing portion of this video, unless you knew what to look for on the box or on the system itself, you wouldn't have any idea if you were getting the 2018 or the 2017 model. So for whatever reason they have, AtGames decided to make the jump from this to this. But how are the actual games on it? The system can look as nice as it wants on the outside, but if the emulation is poor, then it's still going to be junk. So we're going to boot it up, we're going to see if the 2018 model of the Sega Genesis Flashback is worth your time. So when you first start up the Sega Genesis Flashback, you're greeted with a pretty nice looking menu and some catchy menu music. You see the options on the left are my favorites. You have the games you recently played, the games listed in alphabetical order, the Sonic the Hedgehog games, the bonus games, settings, and the about screen. And at the bottom, which is grayed out, are the cartridge games, which would be lit up if I had an actual Sega Genesis cartridge I could use to put into the top of the system. So AtGames also improved on this menu. Before, you could only scroll through the game selections with the A and B buttons, and they did refine that where you can use the directional pad. So AtGames advertised there are 85 games in the system, but they didn't say there were 85 Genesis games. If my addition was right, you actually only get about 50 Genesis games on here. The rest are a mix of these Master System games, some Game Gear games, and the bonus games. Navigating the menu actually isn't too bad. The D-pad works just fine, and you can go page by page by hitting the X or Y buttons. It does help you to go through the 85 games fairly quickly. You also have the option to launch the game right away by hitting Start, or you can hit the A button to select the game where you're taken to another menu. On this screen, you can hit the menu button to select the game as a favorite. You're given a brief description of the game, and if we scroll down, you'll see that you have a complete list of the controller functions. So if you've seen any of my other system reviews, you know that I don't like when a system is compromised of a single series. So out of the 85 games, 9 of those belong to the Sonic series. That is 1/10 of the games. So if you're a huge Sonic fan, then you probably won't mind that at all. But for me, I would prefer if the series was kept to 1 or 2 games just so you have an idea of what the series is about, and use those other slots for other games. There are 14 bonus games, which is 14 too many. These are very generic games. You have Air Hockey, Bomber, which is a Bomberman clone, and I'm going to level with you, I did not try all of these games. I don't have any interest in that. Because these games to me are just filler for the system, and I have no Mr. Balls. No intention of playing these games on the system seriously. But they do come with their own favorites option, description, and controls. Going down to the settings tab, you see we have some bezel options. This system also offers some save state management where you can back up your saves to an SD card, restore from an SD card, or delete all save states. You can also select to turn off the background music. I have no idea what this overdrive option does, and I couldn't find anything in the instructions explaining it. Although at the bottom of the screen you have X and Y to select between the previous and next page, it does not work on this menu for some reason. The system comes with 5 bezel selections. You can choose between no bezel, a bright one with a controller in the corner, a very nice retro themed one with black and blue grid lines, some purple crystals, and another retro themed one with a bright red sky and some blue mountains in the background. Overall, I like this menu. I like the menu music, and it has a lot of options for bezels and different game settings. I'm especially impressed when you hit A on a game and you have the controls right there in front of you and a brief description of the game. It's like a very toned down version of an instruction manual, so there's no need to scan QR codes or go to websites or anything like that. You have all the information you need right here for the game. I would prefer if we had more options on the side here between just the Sonic games and bonus games. Maybe have options for all the Genesis games or all the Game Gear games. Maybe have individual options for those game types as well. So we're going to start up a game and see how it plays. We're going to try Altered Beast first. It's a game I'm very familiar with. I know how the game should sound and I know how it should play, so I think this is a good one to do a demonstration on. So we're going to hit the menu button on the controller, and here's our options. We have save slots. If we hit A here, we have 5 save slots we can choose from. If you look in the bottom right corner, the total available save slots on the system itself is 250. On the bottom left, we have the controls. Use the D-pad to move around different save slots, hit the menu button to go back, save with the A button, load with the B button, and C will delete your save game. The only gripe I have about this part of the menu here is if I want to go back to the menu options, I can't do that. Hitting the menu button takes you directly back to the game, so then I have to hit the menu button one more time to get back here. You can also select to quit your game, which a lot of mini systems don't allow you to do from the controller itself. You usually have to get up, hit a reset button or a menu button or something on the system, but the Genesis Flashback allows you to quit your game, go back to the main menu without having to get up. That is a huge positive for this system. And then at the bottom we have an option for a scanline filter or a CRT filter.
Rise from your grave.
So that sounded excellent. That was one of the main parts I was looking at. I know on my old Flashback console, that did not sound good at all. They did not have the emulation correct on the part where he says rise from your grave. But everything else sounds really good. Take a listen. So it seems like they have the sound down pretty good. I have no complaints about the sound for this game. Let's turn on that filter real quick. I'm not really into CRT filters. I prefer bilinear, which we don't have here, but I don't think a lot of systems have that option. So let's take a look at what it looks like with the CRT filter activated. Looks like a CRT filter. So if you're into CRT filters, you have that option for this system. You can definitely tell when the CRT filter is active. I will give them that. It is very noticeable. Alright, so we just died there. Another function I really like on this system is the rewind function. And yes, that was on the SNES Classic, but for the Sega Genesis Flashback, it is right on the controller. So all you have to do is hold down the rewind button and you're automatically rewinding through the game. And it looks like you can go back a fair amount. I mean, that's a long bar and it's pretty quick too. So like, say I wanted to start this whole boss fight over, I'm just holding down the rewind button and I can start from the beginning again. We're going to take a look at a Master System game. We'll do Fantasy Zone, and I don't have any experience with Master System games at all. But you can see here on the Master System games, everything is the same. You still have the bezel. You can hit the menu button to go into your save slots, same amount of slots for the Master System games, and you still have that scanline filter option. One thing I did notice about the Master System games though is I'm hitting start here, and you can see nothing's happening. It seems like the controller mapping isn't perfect on here, and that the B and C button seems to function as the start or whatever other buttons were on that system. I'm not really sure. I'm not familiar with that controller, but I did notice that start doesn't act as a start button, but it does act as a pause button. But what's important is how the games play, and this game seems to run pretty good. I am familiar with Fantasy Zone, just not this version of it. It's playing fine and it sounds really nice. The last set of Sega games we're going to take a look at are the Game Gear games. So we're going to boot up Sonic Chaos. Upon first booting one up, you can see that the game screen is significantly smaller than the Genesis or the Master System games, and I guess they're trying to keep that same ratio as what the Game Gear had. But even though there's a small screen for gameplay, the game still looks really nice and it sounds good. And playing handheld games to me has always been real nice on a big screen. It kind of brings new life to games that maybe you hadn't played before because, you know, they were handhelds and not everybody wanted a handheld system. So now you can play these games on your big screen. I don't remember Sonic having rocket boots. I guess we should try and take a look at one of the bonus games as well. Let's do Bomber. Seems like the start button doesn't work on this game either. Okay, so yep, this is a Bomberman clone. Graphics aren't that bad compared to what I remember on the other Flashback console. And by hitting the menu button, you have the same options that you do in the other games. You have save slots if you really want to save that game of this. And you can use the scanline filter for that old school feel of this. Here's a game by AtGames itself. Snake, push fire to start. Oh yeah. You guys thought I was joking when I said there's some garbage games, and you know, I would just stay away from the bonus games altogether. Talking about the games, there's a huge selection of Sega games on here, and a lot of them are the big titles like Altered Beast. You got Comic Zone, Columns, Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine. You have the 3 Golden Axe games, Kid Chameleon, 3 different Mortal Kombat games, 4 Phantasy Star games. If you're a huge fan of Phantasy Star, then here you go. You got Rise Star, Shining Force 1 and 2. They have some lesser known titles like The Ooze, and also both Vector Man games. So you can't knock them for the game selection. They have a ton of games on here between the Genesis and the Master System and Game Gear games. I didn't even know Baku Baku was a Game Gear game. I love playing that game on the Saturn. So definitely a positive for the system for the amount of games they have on here. Even if they do have 14 throwaway games, you're still left with a lot of other games that you can spend a ton of time on with the system. I want to give Mortal Kombat 2 a shot too because it's a game I'm really familiar with, and to see if I can do the special moves okay with this controller. And because we're using the 6-button controller, I want to make sure that I choose the right controller options.
Finish him.
Wow, and we got the acid pool fatality, so not that bad. Even though I'm not huge on the D-pad the way it is, everything else was really responsive. Overall thoughts on the menu and games is actually really positive. I think they did a really great job with the menu. It's easy to navigate for the most part, and we're given some menu options that we haven't seen on the other mini systems. Not only that, but AtGames gives you the option to update the firmware to this version of the Genesis Flashback. And all you need is an SD card that is no bigger than 16 gigabytes. And to do that, you just go to the AtGames website into the firmware update portal. Once you've registered your system, you can hit this download button for the update file. You can see here the last update was released on February 26th, 2019. You rename the file to Sega_update image, and then you insert the SD card into your Sega Genesis Flashback. And then you'll receive a prompt saying that an upgrade firmware has been detected, you want to upgrade the console, and then we have the bar saying that it's installing the system update. So you may be wondering why update at all? Well, at the bottom you see we have a new option for SD card, and that's for adding your own games to the system. So there is no hacking needed on the Genesis Flashback to add your own Genesis games. From what I can tell, this feature only allows you to play Genesis games. They have to be in bin format and they have to be named a specific way for them to work, but I've added 10 games here, 10 of my own games, and I've played all 10 of them. They all run fine. So with this feature, the games that they have included on the system really isn't that important when you can add your own games, especially something like Sonic the Hedgehog 3, which you can't find anywhere. And here it is, running fine on the system. Also, any games that you add get the same options available to them as the games that are included. So if I hit the menu button here, I have the same amount of save slots, and I can add the scanline filter on it if I want to. And as you can see here, you're also allowed to use bezels with these games. Like I mentioned, this only works with Genesis games. I tried to trick it into playing some Master System and Game Gear games by changing the file type and things like that, but it did not work correctly. But still, this feature is incredible. It's just like the Commodore 64 Mini, where they allow you to add your own games to the system. It is kind of disappointing that you don't have actual box art for these games. I mean, you might be able to do that. I haven't done much in terms of adding these games except for just doing this part of it, so there may be more to this feature than I know about. The problem is AtGames doesn't have this information anywhere. They just allow you to update the firmware. They don't tell you how to add the games or what format the games need to be in or anything like that. They just kind of leave it to yourself to figure it out. Nevertheless, I think this is a great feature and is probably one of the biggest selling points of the system. So my final thoughts on the Sega Genesis Flashback. I'm actually very impressed by this. It looked like AtGames actually smartened up and decided to make a decent quality product. It's filled with great features and a ton of games, and if you don't like the games that are on here, you can add your own. You have wireless controllers, or you can use your old Sega Genesis controllers and old Sega Genesis cartridges. And the amount of features that it has, you can go back to the menu from the controller itself. You can create a favorite games list, you can add bezels, CRT filter, and I think it's really unfortunate because I think just because the name AtGames is attached to the system that nobody's going to give it a try. I mean, why would you? Their history is terrible. They have a history of making these janky, cheap consoles, and then they actually come out with something that's worth having and nobody knows about it. There's nothing being said about this system. And regardless of why they put something like this out, whether it was because they wanted to get back at Sega for dropping them for the Genesis Mini, or because they heard fan outcry and they actually tried on one of their systems. But when it comes down to it, on an unbiased opinion, this is not a bad system at all. I actually recommend this if you're into Genesis games. My biggest issue with the system are those controllers. They are wireless and they are responsive, but that D-pad is a little bit difficult to use. You will get used to it after a while, but just the feel of it doesn't feel right in my hands. Now the Genesis Mini is coming out in less than a month, and I plan on doing a complete review on that system as well, but I think what I want to do is compare the two systems, see what the pros and cons of each are, and put them together head to head. So you can expect that video after the Genesis Mini comes out and I've done a review on it. Overall, I can recommend this system. I can recommend it highly. It really surprised me and I'm very impressed with it. So I want to know what you guys think. Am I crazy? Have you actually played on this system and have you had a different experience than me? Has AtGames left such a sour taste in your mouth that you're not going to give it a try? Because I understand that. I didn't want to do this at first. Do you think now after watching this video you may go out and try and find one? Especially since you can have whatever Genesis games you want on the system. So I want to hear from everybody. Let me know in the comments what you think. That's it. I recommend the system. Even if it's from AtGames, it still does a really good job, and it is definitely able to compete with the other mini systems. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time.